Hello and welcome to this video on creating an Ivy Bonsai. Ivy is one of the more common species used as a vine type bonsai because it's very common. In our case, we managed to source ourselves a nursery stock specimen rather than having to go digging and traipsing through people's gardens. The upside to this is that it was originally intended to be a hanging vine, which means it's, as you can see, trained in a sort of trellis. That training has led to not only it being incredibly long, but already semi-informal in nature, which means we don't need to do as much work in training the trunk. And notably, the trunk is actually somewhat thicker than usual. Not as thick as it could be, but nonetheless. So the simple beginnings are to remove it from the pot, which, to be honest, is not so easy. Mostly down to the fact that these stupid clips are a real pain. But the advantage to it being grown like this is very simple. Once we've detached them, we can quite literally just pull this out the top. It is very easy to do. It's obviously also a downside to the way they've grown it. They've also included a number of small clip-like things on here that were obviously intended to keep it attached to that trellis, type structure anyway, but they really aren't very good at that, or for that matter anything else. The other downside to this is that the trunk, so to say, is incredibly long and convoluted. As you can see, it's something we're having to untangle, and the untangling process is not easy. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Not just because they're long, but some of them have also become somewhat brittle and rigid. They're more difficult to move out of the way. It can be done, but if you do it with even the smallest error, they begin to snap and break, which sucks hard. Because we obviously want to try and keep this as intact as possible, it involves a lot of moving, wiring, and pruning. But what we're pruning away are these leaves like you see in the front here, at the very bottom. That's not a leaf that will eventually become a branch that we need to keep for any reason, and so removing it now will save us a lot of hassle later on. But removing it now also means that all the growth that's happened is being discarded. But at the same time, we do need to reduce leaf size. As you can see, the foliage is very big. For something being grown purely for greenery, say on a patio or similar, no problem. It'll look just fine. On the scale of a bonsai, much too big, especially the size of the bonsai we're going for in the end. So we'll just chop things away until everything kind of works. And it kind of works in this case because there's not a lot that's ideal. In fact, some of this is just plain nightmarish. Especially once we begin to look at some of the branch locations later on, and the questionable solutions we had to come to when it was, resolving these matters. Most of them were, we're probably going to regret them in a few years, but for now they work well enough. Maybe. So, remove some of the leaves if we can, remove unwanted branches, following the standard left, right, back rule, especially in this case for an informal upright, where the positioning of the branches is actually going to be a little more challenging. If you look at where these leaves are located now, some of them are already in roughly the right place, but they're also too large a curve, let's say. The radius of the bend in the informal upright is just too big. In order to be able to use these, we're going to have to do something, because it just doesn't work otherwise. Now, as with most of these sorts of species, we're going to have to look at how do we bend the trunk. And bending the trunk, particularly as you see it here, isn't as easy as it is with others, largely down to the fact that this trunk is already quite brittle and rigid. Like most ivy species, it goes from a very delicate and also somewhat brittle sapwood branch as it grows out at the start, then gradually starts to harden off, where you get the darker reddish-brownish coloured wood, or bark, and then it goes on to this lighter greyish, tan-coloured bark. Now, this tan-coloured part is where it really does not take well to being manipulated, and more so when we're talking about wire, so we need to think about how to deal with it very carefully. Wiring will be necessary for this, it's just unavoidable. With the wiring in mind, we basically have to spend a lot of time poking, prodding, pulling, and shoving with these things, and especially those very long branches. In order to get them out of the way, we've literally had to fold one of these branches all the way up to the roof and tie it against a hook that's on the roof to try and keep it from being in the way. And that is somewhere between 1.5 or 5 feet above where the workbench is. As you can see, it will be a rather obvious informal upright. There's absolutely no reason to try and turn this into a regular upright, and more importantly, as mentioned, those side branches. One issue we found was that none of the branch locations were very good. In fact, some of them were very bad. More than that though, if we were to try and make this grow over time, we would be sacrificing these large branches very quickly. But, as you can see, with a little bit of wire and giving it time to grow, we can effectively graft a new branch, except we just need to allow time for the bark to fuse. So this will work in creating a new branch in that location, which is great. But there is a major downside we need to mention. You'll note that not only have we not been able to fix it hard against what will become the trunk, so that's already a first big problem, but there's another, and that is the trunk in its taper will not be consistent. Because we're effectively fusing a fairly large length of branch all the way up to here, we're going to have to find a way to try and, reduce the size of the trunk in that area. So we're probably going to have to spend some time later on cutting, pruning, and possibly adding gin and shari to bring that trunk back to a reasonably consistent taper. Now, it's obviously not going to be something we can perfectly achieve, it's just the reality of what we're doing, but it is what it is, and we do need to do that later on. But for now, given the nature of this specimen and the relatively limited options available, this is basically the lesser evil. Of course, again, because of the sheer size of some of these branches and the trunk, wiring is actually quite difficult, and it's one downside to what you could describe as a more advanced specimen. It's just really hard to get wire around all the parts that need to be wired, and not just because they're long and awkward, like with the branch being wired now, but even other branches, such as that large one that goes all the way above where we're working now, that gets in the way as well, so it's actually quite difficult. Now, once we've successfully managed to get all the wire on this branch, we're going to have to look at how we'll set it up. And the way we'll do it is fairly typical for a informal upright. That is, we initially want the branch to go somewhat directly upwards, and not perfectly straight up, but at a slight sort of 45 degrees from the trunk, or possibly even less again. And the reason we want that is having it just off from the trunk almost shows that it was trying to grow straight up at first, like a young healthy branch would, but then due to rain, snow, and other weather, the sheer weight of the branch has forced it to pull itself down again, which is actually a problem we're facing anyway, because that's why we have to add a second piece of wire. The original wire is enough to hold the branch in place if it was just the one branch, and literally just as it was, but because we're having to style this somewhat against gravity, we need to add a little more strength to the wire, and thankfully at least the branch is not going to snap, which was a constant back-of-mind panic. Has it been pushed too far, too fast, and too hard, and will the next sound we hear be the crack, snapple, and pop of a branch breaking? But thankfully, no. We'll have to worry about that later on now, particularly when we remove said wire, because unfortunately the wiring job is, it looks like a spaghetti mess, and that's because we've had to do it somewhat ad hoc, which is rather annoying. Nonetheless, it's done, so at least it's wired, and as said, it will start to go upwards at an angle, more or less keeping a reasonably consistent line with where the trunk was originally, before it begins to curve back on itself. Then we're going to bring it down again after a short ways, that's that nature putting weight and pressure on the branch, and have it sort of curve and undulate. This brings us to the continuation of the trunk, which, given we have two options, we have to choose which of these do we want to grow. And the options are we can either try and choose the inside one, which would be the better of the two, since that's inside the trunk, what would become the trunk anyway, and therefore we'd have to remove it, or we can take the other one, and that would basically leave us with this other branch we'd have to lop off, and that would be just a waste. By taking the rightmost branch effectively and using it as the main trunk, we're able to keep that outside branch, because we can use it later on to form yet another, effectively the same things we've done already here, a sort of grafted branch by almost relocating it, by letting it grow into the main trunk and develop that way. And now, as you can see, we continue to experience the difficulty with wiring, not only a larger specimen as you can see, but also the fact that the branches are incredibly long and awkward. It's really difficult to do this in some ways. It can be done, and just be aware that it is a bit of a pain. And again, we have to be mindful of the fact that the trunk is somewhat brittle. It's easy enough to snap it, but that's not what we want, for very obvious reasons. And of course, as said, the higher up we go, it's just more tedious. And of course that's out of frame, because that's how these things work. You try and set up a scene and it doesn't work, ever. But, oh well, that's a problem for later in the video anyway. As always, you want to bend, and especially in this case where we're talking about something that is brittle, on the wire and not on the trunk. This way, the wire is taking most of the force and then sort of transmitting it the same way a spring does, allowing it to act as a buffer and put that force into effect as a spring. Saves you some of the trouble it's associated, especially with this sort of tree, where it's brittle, of you pushing too high in one place and the force not being distributed evenly and going snap. This will also be an instance where you probably want to have a decent selection of wire available. Now, we've used everything from 1mm wire all the way up through to 6mm wire here. The thickest wire obviously being used along the trunk, and simply because it's necessary. It's a frustrating evil, but it's necessary. And also it means that every time we grab the trunk like this, we end up forcing that other branch we've already wired to be in the completely wrong place. But at least it's somewhat in the right place. And in this instance, it's better to have it at least somewhat correct and come back and fix it again later on, than it is to continue to try and fuss and make it perfect the first time. It basically minimizes the work we have to do, as we're continuously making minor corrections, rather than having to make a major correction at the end. It gives the branch a little bit of relief in between each of our attempts to alter its shape. And again, this helps considerably in terms of avoiding snapping, as we're working more on the wire and to an extent work hardening the wire, rather than just trying to make the wire do its job at once. The work hardening process ensures that as we bend it, it becomes a little more difficult and a little more rigid each time. This means it's better at holding its shape. In this instance, you can see that we want to ensure that that curve exists exactly where and how we want, and leaves we don't want are not going to be where they are. Then we have to look at how to ensure that the roots grow wider. As you'll note, the trunk is fairly consistent and linear in its size the entire way through. Simply put, styrofoam box with soil in it, then a couple of pieces of the styrofoam box that were cut off, put in it instead of a fence plinth or a fence paling or a piece of steel or anything else, and then we put the ivy right on top of it. Now, this would be great if the ivy was in a smaller pot, but that's not the case. In fact, in this instance, the ivy is in a rather large pot, at least compared to what we're putting it into, and that means we won't get the wide growth and we won't get the nabari. You can see that with the roots now. In fact, arguably just coming out of the pot it was in from the nursery, it's more than the actual styrofoam pot will be anyway. So we'll have to cut it, and given that this is ivy and they're at least somewhat more accepting of root pruning might be the polite way of describing what we've just done to this, we can take about half of it off. Now, this is more aggressive than you perhaps should be, but more aggressive or not, it's enough to work for now. And it's really much easier if you just use a saw like this. Now, whether it's a woodworking saw, plaster saw, or in this case a small fine detail saw, it all works fine. Then loosen the roots off, make sure to plant it with a little bit more soil around it, not just to help it settle in, but also to act as a buffer for the wire you can see on the left and right, which will be used to tie it down later on. Now, we can do it this way, or we could have left it as is and just tried to squish it in as best as possible. But this way, we're promoting root growth, especially to the left, right, forward, and back, which will, as mentioned, help, particularly with that Nabari issue. As you can see here, it is not going to transition very much from a wide base to a thin top. It's just a sort of similar finger-thick trunk the entire way from top to bottom. It's just not going to work, especially not for an informal upright, where the trunk is a major feature. Now, after this, it's all fairly straightforward. A bit more wiring, a bit more fiddling, and you can see that it all works out. It's not perfect yet, and it will definitely need more tinkering, but to start with, this is good enough. We have all of our major branches, and then some extra again, and we just have to wait patiently. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below